Going to kick things off. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm Shahana McKenzie, the CEO of Bioenergy Australia, and we are delighted to host this webinar today on carbon accounting of sustainable fuels, a global perspective to inform an Australian approach. So Bioenergy Australia, we are the non-profit industry association for Australia's future bioeconomy. And the relevance here is obviously in relation to our Low Carbon Fuels Alliance of Australia and New Zealand and our Renewable Gas Alliance, and the work that those alliances have been doing to advocate for the development of GO certification for our feedstocks and our fuels. And so we are delighted that the Australian government has progressed down that path. What we're seeking to do with this webinar today is to really provide a baseline level of knowledge and understanding for the Australian industry, for government representatives that might be joining us, because obviously Australia is very much at the beginning of this journey. And so what we would like to ensure is that people have the opportunity to be able to learn and understand from different solutions and options that are operating in other jurisdictions, some of the lessons learned and how we can, in Australia, as we develop our system, we can make sure that we're really learning from what has taken place in other systems, in other countries. So I would like to, before kicking off this webinar, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the lands in which I am on, here in Canberra. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I would really like to thank our presenters that are joining us here today. So we have a pretty incredible group, which is fantastic. To let everybody know, obviously everyone has the agenda, but we have Adam Charette-Castonguay from the CSIRO, who is going to be talking to modelling of biofuel supply chains using the GLOBIOM model.
All right, thank you very much. Well, first of all, can you see my screen?
Sure can.
Perfect. All right, so, well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I sit today in St. Lucia and Brisbane, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respect to elders past and present. And I'd like to also thank Bioenergy Australia for inviting me to present on the GLOBIOM model. So I'll present a little bit about this model and how it is used in the context of biofuel and bioenergy. So just to quickly go through the content, so I'll give a brief description of what the model is and what it is generally used to do, what kind of results you can get from the model. So what's the purpose of using this model? How it is applied in the context of bioenergy and biofuel, because it's applied in different contexts. And in terms of biofuel, sometimes it's used in a very specific context with different specific scenarios. And then I'll conclude with some strengths and limitations of using this modeling approach. So what is this model called GLOBIOM? It stands for Global Biosphere Management Model. It was developed at the International Institute for Applied System Analysis in Vienna in Austria. And it was developed to look at the competition. It's a global model, so global extent, and it's developed to look at competition for land use between different activities, agriculture, bioenergy, and forestry. So the type of model that GLOBIOM is a partial equilibrium model, so economic model grounded in economic theory of market equilibrium. So it simulates demand and supply of agricultural products. And it's a partial equilibrium, so it looks at specific market of the economy. So it doesn't simulate the whole economy like energy, electricity, and transport. It really focuses on agriculture. It's a dynamic model, so it runs at 10-year time step between 2000 and 2100. And the base year is 2000, and generally you would use the period between 2000 and 2020 as a calibration period where you can compare the outputs of the model with observed data or national statistics, for example, to calibrate and make the model fit better observations. And then after 2020 to 2050, more or less, is a period of policy impact assessment, and beyond this is more the long-term projections, for example, that are used by the IPCC. And it's spatially explicit. It's not.
Hang on.
Yeah.
Just shut that one up. You still there?
Yes.
Hello? Oh. That doesn't work.
Is there a question, or should I keep going? Okay, maybe I keep going.
Keep going, Adam. I think we'll mute anybody that happens to accidentally turn theirs off mute.
All right, I wasn't sure. So yeah, this is a spatially explicit model. It's not a very high spatial resolution model because it runs globally. So there is a trade-off there between the global extent and the spatial resolution. So generally it would run at the simulation units would be 200-kilometer resolution across the world, but it's possible to look at a specific country, for example, Australia, and look at higher spatial resolution, which in this case would be 50-kilometer resolution. And it's important to mention that there are different versions of this model. So some versions are developed with bigger emphasis, for example, on biofuel. So in the context of CORSIA, the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, there is a version that is specifically developed to have more feedstock in that version. Some other versions are developed to have more emphasis on biodiversity modeling. So that adds a little bit of complexity when we're talking about the model and the results of the model, because they have different, slightly different assumptions and inputs. But generally speaking, the model works with the same mechanisms. What it does is it looks at production in a bottom-up way, where you start with the mainland covers, for example, cropland, grassland, forests. There's also dedicated energy plantations. And each land cover has, it can have different land uses. So on one simulation unit, you can have up to 18 different crops. Each land use can have different land use intensities. And then all these land uses produce commodities for different uses. So it can be, if we're thinking about canola, for example, it can be used for food, feed, or bioenergy. So there's the first generation feedstocks that can be used for biofuel, but there's also forest residues and energy plantations that can be used for bioenergy. So that's the production side of the market. Then there's the demand side, which is more of a top-down approach. So the demand is, to simulate demand, the world is divided in 37 regions, where Australia is its own region, as opposed to other global models. Often Australia is within an aggregated region. But in GLOBIOM, that's its separate region. And in each region, there would be simulation over time. These are mostly exogenous parameters or scenarios of population growth and economic growth that will determine demand for different commodities. And then there's a simulation of trade and the market based on demand and the supply, the capacity of the land to supply these commodities. Then there's an allocation of the land that occurs through an optimization, which is to maximize the social welfare. And what it is maximizing the producer and consumer surplus. So in a way, maximizing profit of producers and minimizing costs of consumers. And this happens through a land allocation. So land allocation is simulated endogenously in the model. And how it works is that for each simulation unit or grid cells here, for example, in Australia, so this is simulated everywhere in the world, but just to give the example of the Australian grid here, on each grid cell, you have a fraction of land uses. So you don't have one single land use per grid cell, but you have fractions. And the land allocation happens based on the land transition matrix. So not all land uses can transition to another or to all other land uses. There is a matrix that allows each land use to transition to other land uses, although this can be defined by the user. And based on this, and also based on land conversion costs and relative profitability, land will be allocated based on the demand. So what is it used for? The model generally, it's always in different forms. It's always used to look at the impact of drivers of change. And then through market mechanisms and land allocation, you look at sustainability outcomes. So there's a lot of different drivers of change that can be examined, and lots of sustainability outcomes also. But generally, it's, especially in the context of biofuel and bioenergy, the main driver of change would be an increase in demand for bioenergy. So you wouldn't look at impacts of climate change on yields or impacts of economic growth in this case. Generally, the simulation tried to isolate the impact of increasing bioenergy demand. And the main sustainability outcome that is simulated is or reported is the emissions. But it's in the model, you can also look at other environmental outcomes. And so there's been quite a few global applications looking at the implication of increased bioenergy demand on land use change and emissions. So one of the first paper using this model was on the impact of biofuel targets on land use change. Then the model has been applied to look at different things like biodiversity and livestock transitions. But that was one of the first application, and then it's been used for the European Commission for the Renewable Energy Directive to look at land use change, impact of biofuels, and more recently with CORSIA. And you can use the model to look at global outcomes, but you can also look more specifically at a country. So there's been several regional applications, especially in China and Brazil, where you have it makes it easier to calibrate the model for this country and have more nationally specific calibration and outcomes. But at the same time, it still simulates trade, so it's still globally consistent. And this is what we're doing at the moment with developing a version called GLOBIOM Australia, which is calibrated with national statistics. So more specifically, how is it applied to look at bioenergy and biofuels? So as I mentioned earlier, there are different versions and there are different feedstocks included in the different versions. In the main version, there would be 6 first-generation feedstocks. I know that for a version that is calibrated for Europe, there would be sugar beet and sunflower oil as well, but this is relatively flexible, so you can add more feedstock if needed. And for second generation feedstock, there's the short rotation plantations. And in the case of bioenergy and biofuel, generally the model is not applied in a dynamic way. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a 10-year time step, and you can look at simulations sequentially between 2000 and 2100. But in the case of biofuels, often it's used in a comparative static way. So it's not, the model is not run dynamically, but it's run for a specific year in the future. So in the case of CORSIA, for example, you just run the model for 2035, and the steps to get the emission intensity from land use change is that you select one specific pathway. So this is a feedstock, a combination of feedstock and technology. So for example, canola and HEFA technology. You simulate a baseline. So you simulate, you run the model assuming that you have either no biofuel or the current production of biofuel. So maybe in Europe, for example, there is already some production. So you would keep this production as the baseline. And then you simulate the shock scenario. So this is an increase in feedstock demand to achieve a specific energy target. In the case of CORSIA, this is aligned with the International Energy Agency, 450 or 450 ppm scenario. And then you just compare the emissions. So the difference between emissions in the shock simulation and the baseline simulation. And then finally, you look at this difference in emissions and divide this by the difference in the energy produced from the additional feedstock. And that gives the emission intensity from land use change. So an example of the shocks that are used in CORSIA. So in this case, they created two different shocks. So one that is regional. So there is an increase in demand in one specific world region, in this case, the European Union, for canola HEFA, because they already produce or they are already use some of the biofuel from canola. But this is not necessarily representative of the whole world. So they also did a global shock where they have an energy target that is divided amongst different world regions that are susceptible to have an increase in production. So for example, Oceania and Canada. And so once you run the simulations with the shock and the baseline, we can look at land use change, how land is allocated in the shock compared to the baseline. And this is looking at land use change globally. So even if we have a shock on Australia, you'd have to look at land use change outside of Australia as well, because that includes the direct and indirect land use change. So direct land use change is the area that you're converting to produce, for example, canola. But there's also the indirect land use change, because this is a model that simulates the market and trade. And maybe you start switching crops in a existing cropland, for example, replacing barley with canola, but then the demand for barley still has to be met. So for example, barley could be imported from another country, and there could be land use change to produce this barley. So in this case, it's not direct land use change to produce canola, but that would be indirect land use change. And but generally, in these simulations, land use change is reported as the induced land use change. So this is the sum of direct and indirect land use change. And also importantly here, in the case of CORSIA, this is simulated with two different models, GLOBIOM, which is the partial equilibrium model, and GTAP-Bio, which is a general equilibrium model that simulates the whole economy. So as you can see, there can be quite a bit of uncertainty or differences between the two models. So the idea here is to address this uncertainty, and a very simple way is to use two models and compare the results of the two models. And so the emissions from this land use change, so these applications only look at the emissions from land use change, not the agricultural emissions. These are simulated also in the model, but they're not reported for these applications because it's not as detailed as a LCA assessment. So for agricultural emissions, they will use LCA emissions instead. But for the land use change, there are 5 categories, at least in the cases of the Renewable Energy Directive and CORSIA. So natural vegetation conversion, this is land clearing to produce more crops. Soil organic carbon, agricultural biomass is the carbon that is stored in crops, which generally would be negative emissions. And then things like foregone sequestration and peatland oxidation is only occurs in Southeast Asia for the expansion of oil palm plantation. But because it's a market simulation, even if the shock is not on oil palm, there can still be some emission and land use change that leads to peatland oxidation. So for example, in the emissions on the right, there is a little bit of this emission just because of the impact of prices and trade from increasing demand for canola. So I'll go a little bit, I'll skip this one because I'm almost at 20 minutes, but there is a lot of uncertainty in these models, and there's increasing work to try to understand where this uncertainty comes from and sensitivities in the model. And there's some advantages to using this kind of model. For example, it simulates the market and trade and prices, so not that many models are able to do this. But on the other hand, it's not detailed enough to simulate logistics and domestic transport. So it's better suited and simulated global supply chain, not so much the domestic supply chain. It allows for long-term projections, but it's still temporally aggregated. It's well suited to look at trade-off between economic outcome and environmental impacts, but it doesn't include sociocultural or institutional drivers like regulation that prevents land conversion, for example. And it's a pretty complex model, so it's very detailed in the biophysical inputs, but at the same time, it can be hard to understand what are all the processes and assumptions in the model. And so, yeah, it's still a model, so it's still an approximation of future phenomenon, and it's not a full representation of system complexity, of course. So in some cases, you might have to use different models, not rely on one single model. And we have to be clear about uncertainties because these complex models are highly uncertain, especially when we start doing projections in the future. And for decision makers, we need to be realistic about what this kind of model can deliver. So thanks for listening, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you so much for joining us, Annette Cowie. So for those of you that don't know, Annette is with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. And I would personally love to thank Annette for actually helping us craft and curate this webinar and helping us identify the speakers and reach out to them. So over to you, Annette. Looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks very much, Shahana. Yes, as Shahana says, I'm from the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, but I'm actually talking to you today on behalf of IEA Bioenergy, one of the technology collaboration programs under the International Energy Agency. The IEA Bioenergy Network facilitates international collaboration. It brings experts together from industry, government and academia to look at how we can develop and expand and deploy sustainable bioenergy options. I'm in particular associated with the group called Task 45, which is called Climate and Sustainability Effects of Bioenergy within the broader bioeconomy. And methodology for quantifying the climate change effects of biofuels is one of the topics that we've been working on for decades, actually. So I'd like to talk to you about the standard methodology that we have developed. Now, firstly, just for some background, bioenergy is a component of many countries' climate change policies. They've adopted those policies to meet their targets under the Paris Agreement. And you'd be aware that the objective of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. And the Paris Agreement recognises that in order to reach that, we need to reach net zero at a global level in the second half of the century. So that's a condition in which greenhouse gas emissions are balanced by greenhouse gas removals, and bioenergy can contribute to getting us to net zero. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their most recent assessment report, that's the 6th assessment report, emphasised that cumulative CO2 emissions are the main source of global warming. So that is, temperature rise is linearly related to CO2 emissions. So the most critical action we need to take is to drastically reduce CO2 emissions. Now, you might wonder where bioenergy fits in there. Bioenergy is energy from biomass, and biomass is organic material, so that is plants or animals or manure, for example, that hasn't been fossilized, and it contains carbon that came from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. Bioenergy is a renewable resource if it is regrown after harvest. So the CO2 molecules are the same. When biomass is combusted and the CO2 goes back to atmosphere, it has the same impact in the atmosphere per molecule as fossil CO2. The big difference is that bioenergy operates as part of the short-term carbon cycle, whereas burning fossil fuels transfers carbon that was safely stored underground up into the atmosphere, where it causes permanent warming, as I indicated before. So, bioenergy is indeed carbon neutral within the biogenic carbon cycle, as long as that biomass is regrown after harvest, or the bioenergy comes from biomass residues that would otherwise have decomposed or been combusted to waste and put the CO2 back into the atmosphere anyway. It's of course not completely carbon neutral, because there are usually fossil fuels or other greenhouse gases emitted in the supply chain for bioenergy. Within the IPCC's estimates of how we might meet the goal of the Paris Agreement, bioenergy plays a key role in all of the scenarios that meet the temperature goal, different amounts, but up to 30%. It's also a key player in the IEA's net zero emissions scenarios for a global net zero energy sector. Across all sectors, actually, it includes power and heat, as well as liquid biofuels and biogases. But on the other hand, you may have seen some of these headlines. They pop up in the popular press, but they also come in the academic press, suggesting that, in fact, bioenergy can be worse than fossil fuel. And so this is a bit of a confusing situation. If the IPCC says bioenergy is good for the climate, yet there are these papers and claims out there that, in fact, it isn't. And this is where Task 45 steps in to provide interpretation of this divergence in the scientific literature. Now, you're probably aware that bioenergy comes in many different forms. You can make it from a very wide range of feedstocks, such as those illustrated here, and each of those has different properties. And then there are a range of bioenergy technologies that transfer the biomass into an energy product. And they all have different inputs and conversion efficiencies, different co-products. And so not surprisingly, that has an impact on the carbon footprint of a biofuel. And then there's the energy products themselves. If you look at the emissions savings per unit of feedstock, it tends to be highest for heat applications that are quite straightforward, combust biomass and the energy goes straight into the room, for example, or combined heat and power, and then electricity. and it's lower for biofuels from lignocellulosic biomass in general. These differences are quite inherent to the specific bioenergy systems, though, please recall. So some of the reason for a divergence in the literature is due to the wide range of bioenergy systems themselves, differences between feedstocks, technologies and products. But the differences between studies can also be due to differences in the analytical methods chosen by the researcher. And sometimes that leads to different answers when they analyse exactly the same bioenergy system. And often this is actually a subjective choice by the researcher, which can reflect their differences perhaps between different disciplines or different worldviews. And this is why IEA Bioenergy and Task 45 in particular has been trying to tackle this by developing the standard methodology. Several previous tasks have also looked into this over the last 20 years or so. The methodology that's been developed is largely aimed at researchers undertaking studies to develop an accurate understanding of the climate effects of bioenergy, in particular to inform policy development. But we also provide guidance on methods that are suited for more routine assessments, such as for policy implementation. So I'm going to be talking about the new paper that's just been accepted for publication. In fact, I have the proofs ready to look at tonight. But those are a wide range of publications that we have on the topic. So greenhouse gas accounting for all products, including bioenergy, should take a life cycle perspective, considering all aspects such as fossil fuels and fertilizer inputs to agricultural production, fossil fuels used in transport and processing, and emissions associated with waste. The emissions associated with fossil fuel depend across the supply chain for a biofuel, depend on the agricultural production system, the types of biomass, and the processing technology, transport distances and modes of transport, for example. A key choice to make is the modelling approach in the assessment, which depends on the purpose of the assessment. So I'm talking about life cycle assessment here. If it is intended to inform policy, such as to decide whether a certain biofuel supply chain should be eligible for policy support, it's critical that you consider all the direct and indirect effects of that bioenergy system. So therefore, you need to use what's called a consequential approach. But if it's a routine policy implementation, then an attributional approach, which focuses just on the direct effects of the supply chain under control of the operator, is or can be adequate. Another important choice is the scope of the emissions sources and sinks included. So in relation to bioenergy, we're interested in which biomass carbon pools are considered. If there's direct land use change, such as illustrated here, where a high carbon stock forest has been replaced with an oil palm plantation, then the loss of the forest carbon is an emission that needs to be included in the carbon footprint of the palm oil. Adam's already talked about direct and indirect land use change, introduce those terms and explain what they're about. But just in case anyone missed it, it's direct land use change. If you've taken a piece of land which has one land use, such as a forest, and you've replaced it with something like a canola crop, then that's direct land use change, whereas indirect land use change in this example of the oil palm might be if the oil palm was planted on a rice paddy and then landholders cleared forest elsewhere in order to maintain rice production. So when you're looking at direct land use change, the previous land use is critical. If you're replacing a grassland with an energy crop, then there's a possibility that you might have a reduction in soil carbon, for example. But on the other hand, if you were taking degraded land, which generally has a very low organic matter level, and putting in an energy crop, you would often find that you increase the soil carbon. Another important aspect of scope is which greenhouse gases are included. And in the case of bioenergy, the nitrous oxide that's emitted when you apply nitrogen fertiliser can be really important. In this example, from cane ethanol from Queensland, the nitrous oxide is that pale green at the bottom there, which you can see dominates the carbon footprint of the cane ethanol. Another commonly discussed topic in life cycle assessment is how to handle co-products. Many bioenergy supply chains produce other products in addition to the bioenergy. For example, when you produce corn ethanol, this is a study in corn ethanol where they've produced a range of products, and then they've taken the CO2 and they've put it underground, geosequestration, so they also have BECCS as well. The products here are the ethanol, but then also the DDGS, the dried distillers grain solubles, and the corn oil, plus the service of carbon dioxide removal. And so the challenge is to share the supply chain emissions amongst the products. The appropriate approach depends on the modelling approach that you're using. With an attributional approach, you usually allocate based on aspects such as the energy content or the economic value, whereas with a consequential modelling approach, you apply a credit based on the emissions saved when the co-products displace other products. I think Tim will talk to us more about that, but if he doesn't, we can come back to it later. We could talk forever on handling co-products. Another important aspect of the system boundary is the spatial scale. And if you have a longer rotation forestry system supplying the biomass, and you look just at a single stand, you'll see this obvious change in carbon stock dramatically, losing carbon when a forest is harvested and then gradually regaining it as the forest regrows. But on the other hand, if you look across the whole landscape at a forest estate, you see stands of different ages. And in fact, this evens out the carbon stock change over time. So if you had a theoretical ideal forest, we have even age class distribution, so an equal area of each stand age, then you actually have a constant carbon stock. But on the other hand, if you're introducing a policy that takes more of the biomass out for bioenergy, then you might have a reduction in the carbon stock, or if you switched from a longer to a short rotation, and there you would need to take into consideration the emissions associated with that change in carbon stock. Another aspect to consider is when do you start the clock? This is critical for longer rotation plantations. If you start counting at the point the trees are harvested, then you start with a large emission and you gradually pay that back. On the other hand, if you start at the time when the trees are planted, then you first take carbon out of the atmosphere and eventually return it to zero. Another aspect is the climate assessment method that you use. The most common impact assessment method uses the Global Warming Potential 100, GWP 100, which is applied to the cumulative emissions across the whole life cycle. However, there are various other impact assessment methods that have been put forward, and some of these explicitly consider the timing of emissions and removals. And some of these are recommended. For example, the global temperature potential is recommended to supplement the GWP in life cycle assessment. This study looked into 15 different methods that have been published and found that there's a big difference if you have at the top a situation where you had a forest with high carbon stock and it was replaced with an energy crop. Then you get a big difference between the different methods. But at the bottom is the example of an energy crop replacing another annual crop. And there it doesn't make much difference which impact assessment method you use. Now, another really important aspect when it comes to consequential analyses is consideration of the reference, and in particular the reference land use. What would have happened to the land if you weren't producing bioenergy? If it was an existing production forest and the bioenergy was coming from the slash, then it would have been harvested anyway because the purpose of the forest was to provide timber. And so the biomass would just have been left on the ground where it would decompose or be burnt perhaps. On the other hand, there's a possibility that a forest may be converted to conservation and left unharvested, in which case you need to consider what would happen then to the carbon stock and whether it might be more susceptible to wildfire, for example. If it was an energy crop, then you need to consider whether it might displace food production, or if it was grown on marginal land or degraded land then that was unproductive, then that's not an issue. Or what if it was sugarcane that is now spare because the local mill has closed down? There are various ways that we're investigating, for example, in New South Wales, looking at eucalypt species that can be grown in an integrated fashion across the landscape with agriculture and forestry to provide biomass and minimise the land use competition. In the case of residues, you need to consider what would be the reference fate of the biomass. In the case of forests, then the residues might decompose on the forest floor, or they might be burnt to manage fire risk. If it was end-of-life wood products, they might go to landfill, where Fabiana Jimenez's research has shown that they last a long time. In the case of agricultural residues, then they may be burnt in the field, or they may be retained for protecting the soil, or they may be baled and used for some other purpose. So in our standard methodology paper, the new one that's about to be published, we include this checklist for helping the user to work through each of those different choices and choose the appropriate option that's consistent with the goal of their study. And this is a figure that just summarises the standard methodology. Basically, as I've described, you're comparing the life cycle of the bioenergy system with a reference scenario that provides the same service. Now, this image comes from a related study that applied the standard methodology to look at various aspects driving the emissions intensity of different biofuel supply chains. And what we're looking at here is that there are some factors that have a much bigger impact on the result and that have high uncertainty. So, for example, the amount of emissions from palm oil mill effluent has a large impact but a fairly low uncertainty, whereas the nitrous oxide from nitrogen fertilizer and the soil carbon change have both a high impact and a large uncertainty. And then indirect land use change is particularly large in terms of uncertainty and impact. And Adam has already introduced us to the concept of indirect land use change, and Keith will talk more about it. So to summarise the key messages from the standard methodology paper, the methodology has a strong influence on the results, so it's really important that you choose methods that are consistent with the goal. Key aspects are the scope, the sources and sinks included, the system boundary, the reference land use or biomass fate, and also the reference energy system, which I didn't actually mention. Getting the functional unit right is really important as well. As I've emphasised, it's important to choose methods that are consistent with the goal of the study, how you're going to use the result. And if it's intended for informing policy development, then indirect effects really must be considered, and so a consequential approach is important. But if it's for policy implementation, what's important is consistency, comparability, and the control that the operators have over their emissions sources, and so an attributional approach can be relevant. Now, I realise I'm nearly out of time, but I just wanted to quickly show you that there are many studies by IEA Bioenergy, by Task 45, and also by other IEA Bioenergy tasks that are operating that looked into tools for greenhouse gas accounting for biofuels and governance approaches for biofuels. One of these compared the various different calculators that are used in the biofuels policies. Now, this one was published 5 years ago, so these are the calculators that were operating then. And it identified a range of different aspects to the greenhouse gas methodology between those different calculators, which meant that they produced quite different results for the same biofuel supply chain. But that study identified what were the main factors that led to that divergence, and also demonstrated that if you harmonise the methods in terms of assumptions and default values, then they essentially came to the same answer. More recent studies has examined SAF policies around the world, and it's identified the key differences between those policies. And I think it might be of interest perhaps that it's identified 6 particular areas of risk to robustness of the policies, and one of those was related to inconsistencies in greenhouse gas methodologies. So to finish up then, I guess you've seen that there's a lot of work that's been done by IEA Bioenergy, both on the greenhouse gas accounting, but also on other aspects of the sustainability of biofuels. In particular, the work of Task 45 and its predecessors has focused on the methodology and guidance on greenhouse gas quantification for bioenergy systems, with a focus on informing policy development in particular to ensure that policy decisions are science-based. But there are a number of different studies that have been undertaken by IEA Bioenergy tasks, looking into different calculators and accounting methods and certification methods, evaluating them and looking at ways to harmonise and improve those methods. There's also work on feedstock production, which I haven't mentioned at all. So I'd be very happy to answer questions or talk more about IEA Bioenergy, as would various others of us who are involved in IEA Bioenergy. Thanks very much, Shahana. Back to you.
Awesome. We are now moving to Tim Grant, who is the director and founder of Lifecycles, and he's going to talk to LCA and carbon footprint methods for Australian ag commodities. Over to you, Tim.
Great to see many people online. I am from Lifecycles, small consultancy, and have worked in and around this area for many years. Probably the most recent relevant experience was working on certifying canola to the European Union Renewable Energy Directive certification in 2018 and 2023, which got us into the sort of midst of what formalising a life cycle assessment into a certification scheme looks like. But we also work around lots of other projects, both in the sustainable aviation space, biomass electricity and other fuels. And we did work back in the 2000 on the comparison of transport fuels, when a lot of this first became very interesting. I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to do a little bit of a run through some things that are interesting about agricultural data and LCA, because that was in the title of my presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to jump into answering some questions that are in the chat there, really about an approach on the system calculation, or this issue of how you address co-products, that walks the line between what the certification schemes want to do and what we think we want to do in consequential LCA. And we've reframed that a little bit to try and make it a little more palatable. Just a shout out on, everyone loves new data and things, and we're just coming to the end of a project over the last 2 years funded by the Australian government. It's the National Traceability Grants. And we have about 1,000 new processes coming into our National Lifecycle Inventory database, include all broadacre crops, all animal systems, disaggregated in 50 different regions, all parameterized and very, very transparent. And we've also produced the byproducts in there of straw, bagasse, molasses, tallow, also by different regions and things. So that's really exciting data that is due to be released by COB Monday. So I'm really keen to get back and start finishing it. So that's just something people might be interested in. As we did that data, it sort of brings some of, what's latest things that you want to put into data sets about life cycle assessment, and particularly about Australian agriculture. And so what we've done there, we've updated on data product and production efficiencies across Australia, greater coverage of region and crops. We've included controlled traffic farming and the fuel savings associated with different activities with controlled traffic farming, which can be quite important. We've done a better treatment of co-products. And part of that has been modelling downstream, going past the farm gate into maybe the first development of commodities into sugar, into cotton lint, into abattoirs. So we move a little bit further downstream. And we have the Martians, we've maintained a biogenic carbon balance after allocation. We're paying a lot of attention to tracking biogenic carbon through the life cycle as it's required by ISO 14067 that we do that. What we haven't been able to do, and this really links to Adam's work is we haven't been able to put in a number for soil carbon change per crop in per region or for land use change. We've looked and we grappled and we've looked at different systems, and none of them have been particularly robust enough, and they all sat up in the top right-hand quadrant of Annette's thing of being highly relevant but highly uncertain. And we thought just to pick a number out of one of the systems, it would be inappropriate because it does have a really big effect on the inventories. We've put a space for the number and indicated that there should be a number there, and that the left sort of left that to the practitioner to maybe identify those things in their specific context, which is a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's better to have, if you don't have something that's actually usable, valid, then better not to put it there. What else is interesting about Australian agriculture in LCA? We have a lot of very specific tier 2 and tier 3 emission factor approaches. These climate dependent factors for particularly nitrous oxide emissions, and it showed nitrous oxide being very, very important. And if you're not up in those regions growing sugar where you're having very intensive agriculture, for the most part, our broadacre agriculture is very low intensity, and it has a frugality about it where there's low inputs, low production, but that means you never put too much on because you just can't afford it, because there is, the returns are not high. And so what we find with particularly the broadacre agricultural crops in Australia is that they have often very low emissions relative to counterparts, particularly in Europe and some other parts of the world. And so some, to the extent that sometimes they're not believed, like, how is it that low, and so we've had a lot of pushback at times, but I think it's pretty fair to say that it is that frugality of the outback agriculture and a reasonable amount of good practice in the introduction and of low-till and no-till agriculture has really had a big effect. One thing that has created havoc in for people creating biofuels and trying to come up with a carbon emission factor over time, and this happened in the European red situation and is affecting things now, is our nitrogen emission factors, particularly the direct emission factor in the red line there. I don't know the exact dates. I know Annette can probably tell me them. But I know when I started, we were at about 1.25% of nitrogen applied would be emitted as nitrous oxide, and that had a devastating effect on the crop footprint. It sort of went down to 1% as a default internationally at some point Australia was using, and then it plummeted down to 0.05%. And then just recently, it went up by a factor of 5 to 0.29%. This, for companies that are trying to understand what the footprint is of their end product, this has been very unsettling. They're like, well, how did this come about? And and of course there are good reasons for this, and it's the application of field studies and things, and anyone who knows anything about nitrous oxide knows that it is a very volatile process that actually leads to it, and so any number is actually an estimate of a large amount of volatility. But it's sort of one of those things that there are a couple of others, residue emissions and things, so these methodological aspects jump around a bit and are really important to the end footprint of bioenergy products. One other thing that we've uncovered recently, or we sort of knew, but particularly now that those nitrous oxide emission factors are down a little bit lower, the residue emission factors down a bit lower, our fuel efficiency is quite high. We're going to start bringing in solar for pumping and things. It leaves what gets left as one of the main inputs is the production of nitrogen, and particularly the production of urea, using ammonia synthesized through to urea. And the emissions for urea production are jumping around all over the place, depending about where you are in the world. and the technologies that you're using, and in particular the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the natural gas supply chain sitting behind urea. And this really points to Annette's point of the fossil inputs that come into a bioenergy system if it's an agricultural system. And so this is interesting, and what we have noticed over the last 10 years or so, that we're getting less of our urea from China, a lot more of it from the UAE, from the Middle East, which is good for our footprint, but it's sort of, it is very volatile and it jumps around. And what this says to us is, if you're looking to become a bioenergy company, maybe vertically integrated, maybe you need to build a green ammonia plant, or start fixing your own nitrogen from somewhere, because it's representing maybe close to 50% of a dryland agricultural footprint will be coming from urea inputs. Where does the nitrogen go? If we think about, okay, these things are circular, surely we can get the nitrogen back. And it ends up, of course, if you're in a bioenergy system from agriculture, it either ends up in your meal when you crush an oil seed, or if you're using grain and you're producing ethanol, it'll end up in your distillers' grains, which go off and have a very high value of protein, because that's where all the nitrogen follows the protein. And yet we have all these systems like the European red and the canola corsia and other things, which are using energy allocation for sharing of co-products. And so that's a bit unfair for things that are, you're getting protein powder and yet you're valuing it for how much energy, not much metabolizable energy, but literally when you burn it, how much energy is released. And so we've recently been doing some work on this, in this area for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. They have some guidance for doing LCAs on bioenergy, and we have completed, but there's not a release date yet, an update to that guidance to make it more friendly to the EU red and the canola corsia, the corsia guidance. And so that was the remit, was to produce something that was easier for people to use and more aligned to the international certification schemes, of which there are quite a few. What we did, and we wanted to address this issue of allocation and things, and so we essentially broke things up into two approaches, what we call the commodity approach and the project approach. And we did this, we could have called them attributional and consequential, but attributional and consequential sort of have a whole lot of other connotations. Some people hate one and hate the other, and are very and we're not sure when we say we're going to do consequential, where it's going to be full consequential right through every aspect of consequential modeling, which requires marginal supply chains and all sorts of other things. So we wanted to just have a consequential-ish and an attributional-ish approach. So we refer to them as the project and commodity. So the project approach is going to be used about consequential, focuses on all the functions of the system, looks at displacements based on BAU, but does not use substitution to solve for the bioenergy product. And we'll see what that looks like in a moment. For the commodity approach, it's going to be aligned to the energy allocation, just focus on the production of the bioenergy commodity and just partition everything else out using allocation. And so these are the two approaches that we're sort of recommending can be used. So if we look at the commodity approach, let's say we've got we've got some waste feedstocks, and we've got 3 products coming out of a system. This could be a sugar system. We basically, the non-energy products, we allocate out based on their energy content, and we know that's not very sensible, but that's the rule. And so we just use energy allocation, and we get an answer for the bioenergy, and the reference system is fossil energy, which is already an energy product. And so it's a really simple calculation. Cool. It means that you need to define wastes, are particularly defined outside the boundary, so any waste you get for free. any waste treatment you do for something, you also get for free, or you don't get any benefit for it. So that's the simple approach. And then we're like, if you have a bioenergy system that has some complexity about it, that produces a lot of non-energy related byproducts, then maybe you want to use the project approach. And so in the project approach, which is very much ISO 13065 approach, we have the bioenergy system and all of the things that it does. And so it produces bioenergy projects, it produces products, it produces non-energy products, it produces waste treatment services. It may be disposing of complicated waste. It may be using a waste that actually could be used somewhere else. And then we compare that to the reference system where you meet all those same functions that are met by the bioenergy system. So you produce a fossil energy equivalent, you produce an alternative to the non-energy products, and you produce an alternative to the waste treatment service that is provided by the bioenergy system. And we stop there. What would normally happen in our previous guidance and what Annette showed before, where she had things being subtracted off, is that you would then subtract off those non-energy things and put them back on the bioenergy side. And so it's called system expansion with substitution, where you substitute off and you give yourself credits for doing all these different things. We're now saying, well, let's not do that, because one of the reasons is in these schemes and things, everyone's obsessed with percentages. And percentages are horrible when you start doing things like this, because percentages don't make sense when you don't have a common baseline. So we recommend not to do this. So I'll just take you through an example of why we're recommending not to do this. Let's imagine we've got, we're going to make sustainable aviation fuel using advanced fermentation from some organic waste to produce lipids, fertilizer, and naphtha. We're all going to come out of our bioenergy system across that top line. So we're producing 4 different products. We have a reference scenario for the project approach, where landfill is the alternative disposal, urea is the way we make fertilizer, lucerne is the way we make naphtha. Okay, that should be naphtha. Sorry, I might mess that up. And we have a crude oil and refinery to make the airline fuel. So if we look at this approach, using the project view, we have the reference scenario where we have to go and we make aviation fuel, we make organic waste treatment, so that's a landfill, we make fertilizer, and we make hydrocarbons. At least it's right in the graph. We make some hydrocarbons using a conventional refinery. And in the bioenergy system, it's actually one process. We take in organic waste and we produce stuff, and including all the aviation, all those services all come out of that one production system. Where in the reference scenario, there are like 4 production systems, because the functional unit here is defined by whatever things the bioenergy system produce. If we were to break up that bioenergy system, we could see the allocation of aviation fuel and to its different components. And in fact, the commodity approach, what the commodity approach does is just actually take those grey bars. And so that's the comparison of the commodity approach, is in the grey bars, where you're looking at the energy fraction of the reference system and the energy fraction of the bioenergy system, and they become your commodity view. So here, under the commodity view, you have a 27% improvement. Okay, that's cool. That's pretty good. Under the project view, because you've got a lot of non-energy products and you've got some waste treatment services, you've got a 68% improvement, because this is a bioenergy system. Has many. So the percentage calculation there is really the percentage of improvement of all the things done using the bioenergy system and not using the bioenergy system. If we were to do system expansion with substitution, we end up with, and we move all those benefits across from the reference scenario and we negate them from the organic waste scenario. So we essentially take this blue, yellow, and orange and we put them underneath, we end up with a net negative number. And so the system's got a 209% improvement based on the reference scenario. And no one believes that, and that doesn't sort of make sense to people that something can be more than 100% less. Now, I know with BECCS and things that is possible that there will be net negatives, but we feel that this view here can become a bit of the tail wagging the dog. You can have one quite small fraction of the product and then lots of things subtracted from it, all of which might be claiming greenness in and of themselves. So if you stack all of the benefits of this waste treatment service and of this fertilizer production, and you stack them all and say all their substitution benefits are going to land onto the fuel, that means you've essentially sold their carbon credits or their benefit to the fuel endpoint. And the people using those products can't say, oh, I'm using a recycled organic fertilizer, because it's been sold to someone else. And yet, so there is a potential there for misappropriating or misinterpreting that data. So, yeah, while I think I really agree with Annette that there is a real need to look at certification schemes, we've got to make simplifications, and you need to make something that works and not require a really complicated, and you need some level of standardization, but there is a real risk of skewing the market with unintended consequences with those simplifications. And so what we've aimed to do in that approach, which will be in the new ARENA guidance, is provide a really simple view. But if your product is more complex, then you can present a percentage and a total carbon saving around the entire project for consideration. Now, how you then load that back to the original certification scheme is sort of a bit of a challenge. But that's me. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. Incredibly fascinating. A lot of information. I hope people are enjoying the presentation so far. And once again, just a reminder, pop those questions in the chat. We have a couple that are going to be making their way to the Q&A at the end. No doubt, everybody is looking forward to this one. It's a topic that is getting a lot of discussion at the moment. So, incredibly grateful to have Keith Kline joining us, distinguished scientist from Oak Ridge National Laboratory over in the US, joining us remotely from over there. So thank you. And Keith, we know you're jumping on a flight in a couple of hours, so very much appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about alternative approaches to assessing indirect land use change in biofuels. Over to you, Keith.
All right. Can you hear me okay? I didn't hear your reply, but hopefully that was a yes. Anyway, we're going to try this in a hybrid mode. Okay. I'm holding my phone here. So thank you. I'm delighted to be here and to be able to share some ideas and hopefully have time for discussion. So I'm going to move right along. I should mention that let's see if I can move this along. There we go. Some people might say I'm biased because I was raised on a farm. I come from a family of farmers in Michigan, and I would like to recognize that land was historically under the stewardship of the Potawatomi and other tribes, and they did a really wonderful job, and they're still some good neighbors, and we appreciate it. But I studied renewable energy back in the 70s due to the famous oil crises, and now it has jumped ahead too. Anyway, spent 24 years in developing countries, mostly trying to conserve forests and biodiversity, but working with communities at the same time to improve livelihoods. And I know we need action now. I've seen the deforestation. My challenge in every country I worked in was to how to effectively mitigate deforestation. And it is a challenge when you get down on the ground. But we can do things. It's possible to do things if you do get on the ground with people and work together, and that's the good news. So this is all related to the land use change and modeling, however. And today I'm presenting this information on behalf of the BioFuture Platform Initiative, which is under the Clean Energy Ministerial. so I'm not speaking officially as the U.S. Department of Energy today. The BioFuture initiative did give me the honor to help lead a sustainability work stream, which is trying to promote an evidence-based understanding of biomass production and use, ensure appropriate roles for sustainable biomass, reduce sustainability risks, and build awareness on the role of sustainable biomass as a foundation for really building circular, sustainable rural economies. And we have several documents online on the BioFuture platform website and the resources related to these products that have been developed, and more are coming. Last year, specific to this, we helped organize some workshops and reports that were shared at the ministerial meeting a little less than a year ago, and also some IEA reports. And Annette actually showed a couple of slides from those reports, which were important. We also had GLOBIOM represented as we developed, and this was a challenge. We had about 45 people from all around the world trying to agree on a statement about carbon accounting of biofuels. And the words on these slides were fought over for about a full day with a few breaks. And I want to thank Nick Hinkle and the GLOBIOM team that supported some of this. But we think that it's really important to have good carbon accounting for sustainable biomass to continue to expand in an appropriate way. And we generated this consensus-based set of recommendations that we then shared with the ministers at the G20 and in what was called the high-level dialogue for the Energy Transition Working Group. And so this summary was presented there, and I'm going to share it with you now. And some of it's very common sense. We can improve consistency and comparability if we use consistent methods and apply life cycle assessment in ways that are transparent, evidence-based, and verifiable. Using consistent system boundaries when we're comparing things, and applying, when they're available, maybe we should say the best available international standards. And there's some out there on greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprints. Yes? Okay. Anyway, we think it's important that the data that you use for life cycle assessment are representative of the system being assessed. We also think it's important to continually improve our methods, and those can be further improved by looking how we can collaborate to have more consistent approaches to this allocation question, which was just actually discussed for co-products. How do we deal with those co-products when the bioenergy biofuel is one of many products? Carbon removals and measurement and carbon credits. These are areas where we have methods, but we think there's still room for improvement, especially for alignment and harmonization. We agreed as a group that quantitative indirect land use change values cannot be directly measured or scientifically verified. They are products of a model. And for that reason, we agreed as a group that quantitative iLUC values or factors should be avoided in greenhouse gas accounting. They haven't really provided consistent results across models. And most important to me, we've been discussing this topic for about 20 years now. Some of the first iLUC modeling examples came out of the University of California, Berkeley, about 2005. And here we are 20 years later, and we're still debating a lot of the same things. And I don't think it's really had a positive difference on the ground. And like I said, I've worked on the ground trying to stop deforestation, and I don't see these models making a difference. So we need action urgently that can unlock innovation and actually help protect forests and biodiversity. And we need to document sustainable fuels using robust, credible, and effective mechanisms. We think that you should have verifiable metrics that are technology neutral and feedstock agnostic. Just because something comes from sugarcane or corn doesn't make it first generation or worse. We can have, I think, third generation fuels coming from those traditional feedstocks, if you combine them with BECCS, for example. There's a lot of things that we can still do to improve every system. And the most important, this is maybe my most important point to share with this group, is that certification should be about creating incentives for continual improvement. The world is changing, markets are changing, climate is changing. We need to be able to adapt and adjust, but there's always room to improve. And there's always a need to help people improve. So I think that designing systems that are performance-based and support continual improvement is really, really important. These were questions that the high-level dialogue was asked, and they wanted solutions. And one of them is just to start with the international standards that are there and methods that can be reproduced and verified. Some inconsistencies, like with iLUC, could undermine performance-based programs, because a farmer or a landowner in Australia or here in Tennessee in the United States cannot do anything about this global iLUC model number that's putting a value on their product. There's a lot of things they could do, though, that would reduce the emissions and improve the productivity and build soil carbon. We should give them incentives for that and not penalties for things they can't control at all. So some of my concerns about iLUC, and I should say, every effect that is caused by a policy or a production system, we should monitor and we should be held accountable for it, even if it occurs far away in time or space. For me, those are direct effects. If there's a causal chain and linkages that I can verify, I want to count them. I believe in counting what some might consider indirect effects in another country or at another time if it's directly linked to the causal action. But iLUC modeling isn't about that. It's about a lot of simplified classification of land. I look out my window and I look at a hectare of land that has 15 different uses. And it could be classified at least 3 or 4 different ways in one of these models. And most land is multiple use, and its uses and priorities change over time. But models just simplify, generalize, and do not capture this complexity and the ability of the world to respond. These other models don't do well going into the past, because one thing that happens is when prices go up, rather than expanding into new production areas, as the models assume, what we've seen historically is people produce more on the land that was already cleared, and it's close to markets, close to roads, and easily increased in production. It can be done that year, that in response to that market. We can increase yields very quickly if the market demands. So there's a lot of flexibility and responsiveness out there. The drivers that are assumed, the shock in demand, we have a surplus of production. We have the ability to produce more and more corn. We have contests in the United States. We have 300 to 600 bushel per acre corn winning these contests. And that's unirrigated and irrigated, respectively. We averaged 30 bushels per acre from 1930 to 1950, 36. And we're about triple that now, but we can produce more. There's just more risk when you try to produce more. And if there's not a market to absorb it, why produce it? We throw away 40% of the world, 40% of the food we produce in the world. So it's not really a shortage of this stuff that's causing a problem. And these iLUC models assume that everything is used, and that when you use a little bit more over here, you have to replace it over there. That's not how the real world works. And when it comes to damaging deforestation, oil and gas, which we're trying to displace with biofuels, are the #1 challenge that I faced in every country I worked in. They were above the law. And after that were other high-value extractive enterprises that would punch into the forest, build roads for extracting valuable materials, metals, logging. And there's a lot of other things going on with local politics that determine if and when land is cleared and destructive land use change takes place. And a lot of it has to do with the lack of rule of law and the governance systems in place. So these things are not in the models. And so the models don't really reflect what's going on. And as I mentioned before, one of my biggest concerns is that I'm afraid that the iLUC modeling has undermined the ability to give more incentives to our farmers and our producers, and that's important. So after 20 years of debate, we still don't have agreement. We still can't test them with evidence, and I think we need to do something about it. So the simple thing to do is measure what's really happening, because there is stuff happening. Land is being cleared, and understand what is causing it at that time and place, and decide, is that something we want or not? If it's something society doesn't want, then we should act to try to make it not happen. So the IEA, as I mentioned, the BioFuture Platform Initiative supported a series of workshops and reports, including this one on common criteria for sustainable fuels. Another one's coming out actually a month, a follow-up report. And the recommendation in that report is apply a risk-based approach or empirical measures. What does that mean? That means look at your actual production system and think about, are there direct linkages that could have negative impacts? Where are we sourcing our inputs from? What are we really displacing if we're displacing something? And what is the realistic impact of that? Analyze your system with the people that know it the best, the people that are there on the ground. And that's the empirical measurement of what's real. And if something happens, monitor any protected area, any high conservation value area we should monitor and try to protect. And if something's going on there, then respond. That's the empirical approach, and taking responsibility and being accountable for that direct land use change. If we do that, then there's no more indirect land use change. It's all being accounted for. We can get out of this whole diversion, which is what I'm afraid it's been. It's been a big diversion of discussion. So apply methods that are documented in these consensus-based international standards, and think about the local context and including stakeholders. I think this is also part of the solution. Another issue we are still having is this issue of clear and consistent terminology. People say iLUC and DLUC and land use change. Land use, as I said, is not properly and consistently defined. Land uses are multiple and changing hourly in many cases. And when you add change to it, you've just complicated everything. When we want to look at water and water quality and water footprint, we look at a lot of things we can measure and verify about the water. We should measure what's important about the land. And then there's always the issue of food security, which is one of my favorites because it's what I worked on and overseas a lot. And there's actually a study coming out. I was a reviewer for it. Hopefully very soon it will be published, looking at a lot of detailed data over time in Brazil. But the conclusion is bioenergy production and expansion, whether it's in Africa, Asia, South America, or the United States, it tends to benefit those that are involved in it. And if they're rural producers, that improves their food security. But there's not been any documented negative empirical evidence against it. It's all in the models. But think about it. If the people most at risk of food insecurity are rural populations, which is what FAO tells us, and we're giving them better infrastructure and technology to produce more, because it's an expanded market opportunity for biofuels, you're going to be improving food security for those groups at least. The other thing is that I found really interesting in my research is that we're using less and less land to grow more and more, and both in the United States and globally. We're still clearing land, but it's not because we need it to produce more. The models assume that, but we're clearing land for a lot of other reasons. We could feed the world in 2050 with about 1/20th of our current land if we really wanted to put it to its maximum productivity. So my final slide here is that I've been working on this in almost 45 years now. I started overseas in 1980 in Ecuador. And we can't measure everything. We can't do everything. But we need to apply measures that are verifiable, impactful, and meaningful to the local people on the ground, and focus on what's most important to them. And we need to keep helping people understand science is important. Science has gotten society to where it is today and many benefits, and we need to keep applying science. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the presenters that have joined us today. Really appreciate it. Well, we have a bit of time for Q&A, and we might wrap up early if we don't get more questions that come through. I have a few that I'd like to raise as well. Probably the first one that I'm going to go to, and this is directed probably to you, Annette, but interested in lots of other voices and opinions relating to this. And it's from Pauline Kennedy from BP. So how might we align what we do under the GO on accounting with accounting approaches established under the ACCU scheme, like soil carbon, etc.? So very keen, Annette, for you to lead off, but then also interested in others' views.
Starting to lose my voice.
Keith, I think you need to go on mute. Thanks very much, Shahana. Yes, this is a really important question. The slides that Tim showed, or he discussed how important it is to use Australia-specific data, and he demonstrated how the nitrous oxide emissions factor has kind of flipped around over time. But in general, it's much lower than the rest of the world. So it is really important. We'll be shooting ourselves in the foot if we use average global defaults. What we need to do is utilise all the work that's being done on emissions factors, etc., on impacts of climate. It's been done for the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. It's inside the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, but you need to read all several hundred pages of the volumes in order to find out how it works. But there is a new project underway at the moment. It's called the VEERS, the Voluntary Emissions Estimation and Reporting Standards, and it's being led by the Commonwealth TQ in conjunction with DAF and also the CRC for Zero Net Emissions Agriculture. And what we're working to do is to develop a voluntary national standard on greenhouse gas accounting on farm, and it'll be developed. It's due to be published by the middle of next year. It'll include a framework standard and also a guidance document, a manual on how to apply it. And that is where we're going to bring together the various science, all the work that's been done for the national greenhouse gas accounts, all those life cycle database work that Tim has been talking about, in order to take into consideration things like variable yields and nitrogen fertilizer emissions in our different commodities. So what the challenge will be how you design a simple enough tool that is sufficiently robust, but is practical to apply when it comes to greenhouse gas accounting for the GO scheme.
Brilliant. Do we have Timothy, Adam, Keith, any thoughts or views?
No, I think I presented the challenge of making sure we account of the non-energy products within bioenergy systems is a key question of how that is done. I think to simply partition them out is really problematic and undervalues the integrated nature of a bioeconomy, which is what we're driving towards. So I think I recognise. So yeah, hence I think that's why we came up with that approach for the ARENA guidance.
Yeah,
Adam?
it's a challenge. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say it's a challenge for measurement, but ideally we want to look at the landscape and the services it's providing to society, and try to optimize all those services. And the bioenergy system is just one of those things. And if its inclusion is helping the overall landscape improve its benefits to society, that's then we're moving the right direction. And if it's not, then we're not. Now, that's a mouthful even to say, and it's even harder to do, I know. But I think that, again, getting back to the actual communities and local stakeholders and thinking about their options and their desired futures and how this project may or may not help them is where I feel like the rubber meets the road. And that should always be considered. It's kind of like some people call it social license. And I think that that's an important variable in all this. Thank you.
Adam, did you have any further comments?
I'm sorry, I cut off for a bit and I missed the question. Is it possible to?
Yeah, so the question was in relation to, let me just pull it back up so that I can read it exactly as it was. How might we align what we do under the GO certification scheme on accounting with accounting approaches already established under the ACU scheme on things like soil carbon?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Well, I can only talk about in terms of the modeling, how would that work? And that's a good question because the ACU scheme is an incentive to increase carbon sequestration. So obviously that impacts land use change and reduces the risk of deforestation. So that's something that I think needs to be taken into account in the modeling because the more ACUs you have or the more incentive to reduce deforestation or increase carbon sequestration, the less or direct and indirect land use change emissions you would have.
And maybe just to add, I think one thing we could do is identify in those systems that when we are deliberately trying to build soil carbon or a carbon store, that we identify that as a separate product. So, you know, this system makes sugar, stores carbon. So we identify that as a function of the system and maybe treat it similarly to the other multiple functions that the system produces.
Yeah, okay, great. Interesting question here from Catherine Chapman. Is there a gap in CI calculations for avoidance of virgin fossil products for things like tire oil, given that tires are made up of 40% of natural origin for emissions avoided from waste products being used as energy products? Who would like to take that one on?
Tim?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure there's a gap. I think there's a convenience thing where we talk about renewable diesels being basically fossil-based, waste-derived fuels and things. Typically, when we have done LCAs in those areas, we account the appropriate biogenic and non-biogenic components, and it can make a really big difference to the end outcome. And tires are really tricky because if you just leave them out in the outback, they sort of store their carbon, and it's not the worst outcome in probably the first 50 to 100 years of them sitting there, the eventual thing. So they are some of those waste products. I think it sort of seems to make sense to convert them to energy, but it sort of presuppose without a strong carbon sequestration in those systems, they often don't look very valuable as an end byproduct.
Any additional comments in relation to that one from anyone? Nope, perfect. Now, Annette, you did answer this question in the chat, but I feel like it would be good for you to just, in case people haven't seen it. So what would you use under the GO RE methodology?
Well, I tried to indicate that I thought this was actually something that we should discuss really, but in what I presented in the standard methodology, we would say that the GO scheme, the implementation of it, so if we're asking what should somebody who has to work out the greenhouse gas emissions from their particular biofuel apply, that would fit in the policy implementation bucket. And so that would be consistent with an attributional approach that doesn't need to take into consideration indirect effects such as indirect land use change that Keith has talked to us about how uncertain that is, etc. And I was pleased to see that would actually be consistent with the methodology that Tim has shown us. Seems that we might be aligning here. It also aligned with the recommendations that Keith showed us from those high-level interactions that he's involved in. But it is probably important to point out for those that aren't aware that indirect land use change is included in the CORSIA methodology. Historically, it was proposed for inclusion in the EU RED, and they actually went as far as quantifying iLUC for a range of different biofuel supply chains, and then they put the numbers in a table and it's in the policy, but they didn't ever actually require the producers to use it. And so this is quite a strong difference, which will have a really big impact on producers in Australia if they need to include indirect land use change. And as you can hear, there's quite some divergence of opinion on whether it should be necessary. And one of the key reasons for not including it is because it is so uncertain. But also, as Keith pointed out, it's better to tackle the problem exactly where it is with a governance approach to manage deforestation, if that is the problem that you're trying to tackle, at least in my opinion. Thanks.
Great, Annette. Very keen for others to bring their views on this one. Timothy?
Yes. Sorry, I was happy with that answer.
He's doing his email again. No,
no, I wasn't. I think.
But Tim, you're involved in work that is including indirect land use change estimates in life cycle inventory databases, so that people wanting to do life cycle assessment might choose to include indirect land use change. I'm really interested in your view on
look, I think I worry about I find the iLUC, obviously it's problematic and it's difficult, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong and unnecessary. I remember it was 10 years ago when we had the grain shortages and a few droughts, and we're only 425 days or something until we run out of a bunch of things. I think COVID showed us how vulnerable we are and supply chains are. And so I don't think I think it's really important to understand those global displacement issues. And so, I think we have to keep working on how to have it in and how to account for it. But I think, we need to be aware of its uncertainty, and we need to do more work on, practical ways. And I do quite like, I think maybe Keith mentioned that you sort of give the right incentives to head things in the right direction, even if the science isn't perfect, and you've got to make some compromises, that something, directs people in a certain direction until you get to a point, and then, we will see whether the iLUC really will start to see that very quickly. If it is, those pressures do come to bear, we'll start to see it, and then we'll, respond maybe to that.
Yeah, good follow-on question has just come through. Annette, did you want to go back? Did you have something you wanted to say?
I just wanted to summarise that my perspective, and consistent with our standard methodology, would be that it's useful if the life cycle inventory databases have an option to include indirect land use change, and that is important when you're doing a research project to look into that possibility, but that it wouldn't be consistent with the methodology to include it, and it seems inappropriate to require it when an attributional approach that's used for policy implementation. So it's important to, I definitely agree, to have the information available, but to understand the uncertainties around it, and to look at other means of managing it. Thanks.
So staying on a similar sort of theme, how would the Australian government use, let me hang on a second, we've just jumped down in terms of questions. So how would the Australian government use a governance approach for imported feedstocks for iLUC? Anyone?
I think we already have certification schemes around feedstocks, ISCC and RSB and those things, and I think they, so I think they already exist. I think that, from everything I hear, that they are very, very good at certifying things on the ground, and so I would embrace those, at each point of the supply chain, and we then need the traceability and things that would connect those pieces together to make sure that any imported feedstocks or fuels made from imported feedstocks account that have that certification associated with it.
Shahana, the approach that's been taken there is to identify low iLUC risk biofuels. So you do the research, you identify where the risk of iLUC might be high. You don't require a quantification of it inside your greenhouse gas accounting. Instead, you use it to choose which are the eligible supply chains. So the RSB approach is to identify the low iLUC risk supply chains.
Yeah, okay, great. Adam or Keith, any comments?
I just wanted to comment, if you can hear me, on the excellent point Tim made about how drought and extreme weather events have caused disruptions in supply. And there's some really good data to show how the US and Brazil have traded ethanol actually back and forth in response to the markets, and kept both markets in balance, basically, despite some bad years in Brazil with sugarcane or some bad years in the US with corn. And the US actually had the worst drought that the USDA had recorded ever in terms of impact on Midwestern corn and soybean production. And there wasn't a blip in global markets hardly at all, mostly because there was a whole lot more production in a whole lot more places. And that's the only time that the flow of corn to biofuel was reduced and was allowed to make up for that shortfall that occurred due to the drought. So having this huge additional market for biofuels gave us a supply cushion that fills in and prevented a problem. And so there's a lot of value to that. And there's a couple of papers published on it that are in the references at the end of my slides that if any of y'all want to see. Thanks.
Awesome. Adam, did you have anything to comment?
Well, more a general comment, following up on Annette's response, just on the fact that I think there is a lot of uncertainty around iLUC, of course. And also it's sensitive to the shock, the scenario that you're using in the modeling. So to use a single value is a bit tricky of emission intensity, because it really depends on what is the scenario, what is the shock that you're applying. I think it can be good to have the option to include an iLUC value, not necessary as part of the final emission intensity, for example, but have this information of what could be the emission intensity under future production or demand. But also it's important to make it transparent that why do we have this value and the assumptions, because if you just have one value of 24 grams per megajoule and you have no idea where that comes from, that's where start to have a bit less trust in the values.
Yeah, okay, great. Probably going to be wrapping up soon, but how would the panelists propose we account for challenges such as food versus fuel with oilseed crops, which potentially may end up in human consumption supply chains also? Keith, it looks like you want to take that one.
Well, yeah, I had a couple of slides on that I really didn't cover very carefully because I felt like I was maybe running out of time. That's a good question, and food security is a priority. So the best way to do that is to look at where food insecurity is happening and try to understand why, and see if there's anything that the biofuel sector or bioenergy industry can do to help. There's as I said, there's no empirical evidence to suggest a big impact from biofuel production and food security either way, but there's empirical evidence to show a small impact that's favorable to those who are at risk. And I would recommend that people look at a paper called Biofuels and Food Security Priorities for Action that analyzes this and addresses this question directly. It's in Global Change Bioenergy, GCB, no, Global Climate Change Bioenergy. That's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Annette, it looks like you'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those topics that's been debated for a really long time, 20 years at least. And as Keith indicated, there's plenty of evidence that actually having a market for biofuels has stimulated corn production, at least in the US. So it's not a straightforward thing to say that if you grow a crop that could have been used for fuel, that you're displacing food production. The other important thing is to identify that we actually have a big problem to solve as society, how we use our land most wisely to meet our multiple objectives. Society does need energy as well as food. Society also wants to conserve biodiversity. So internationally, there's a move to encourage sustainable land use systems that look into mosaics of land uses across the landscape that can simultaneously supply those needs. And we should not think of a hectare of land just because it happens to be growing wheat this year. It's always needs to be growing food. We have to be more nuanced. We have to think more broadly about the best ways to use our resources to meet society's needs. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Adam, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And there's the aspect of food security and having food availability, but it's also food affordability, because the more demand you have for a commodity that can be used for food or fuel, it raises prices and then it makes it less affordable. So that's beside the quantity, there's also to what extent you can afford it. And yeah, just on the multiple objectives of using land. So the focus is often on emissions, but there's food, but there's also biodiversity conservation, and there's a lot of environmental outcomes that should be considered when using land, not just emissions. So I think that's we have to start a little bit to consider more outcomes than just emissions, I think, in these assessments.
Great.
I
Tim,
would beg to,
yeah, okay.
to mention that the models that insist there's this spike in price because of the additional demand for biofuels are based on that model and its static assumption that there's a shock in demand. Tell the corn farmers in the United States who are looking at prices that are as low as they've ever been, and we're producing more biofuels than ever, that the prices are higher because of the biofuels. What I do think is that biofuels help create a price floor. This additional market, a broader market and more options for selling help create a price floor. And it's the extreme variations. It's the prices going too low and then prices going too high that's worse. The worst for the small farmers, to be honest, and that's what's worse for food security is the high volatility. So anything we can do that reduces volatility, and there's a whole section of that paper that I referenced on this, and provide more safety to those at risk in terms of food security is going to help. And biofuels actually can help. In many cases, they have. And yeah, I'll stop there. I'm going to have to run. Thanks, everybody. It's been
thanks,
very
Keith.
interesting.
Thank you. Before we finish up the session, I'm probably just keen on asking each of our panelists one question. So the Australian government is obviously right now, working through the design and development of the GO certification scheme for Australia in relation to low carbon fuels and renewable gas. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to the government as they embark on this journey? And Annette, only one piece. So Annette, I'm going to go to you first, and then I'm going to go to Tim and then Adam.
Don't reinvent the wheel. You look at what we've already done through various life cycle assessments supported by rural RDCs, the work of the National Greenhouse Inventory and the CRC for Greenhouse Gas Accounting, and that new project I talked about, the VIAS project.
Awesome. Tim?
I think it would be I was going to say, be consistent internationally, because we're not producing things in Australia in a vacuum, and it's a global market. So be consistent with what happens internationally, but have it nuanced within that to actually take account of the particular conditions in Australia, and be performance-based rather than overly prescriptive. Avoid lists, the predefined lists of approved processes and things, which often leaves innovative approaches out in the cold because they don't come under the predefined list. Sorry, that's a very long version.
No, great. Adam?
Yeah, I would say that use different approaches that are fit for purpose and that are transparent so that people can understand why we get the outcomes.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. This session will be available on Bioenergy Australia's YouTube channel. So feel free to watch it again if you'd like to grab any of those details again. So once again, thank you so much to the speakers that have joined us today and to those that have joined us to watch and look in. And we look forward to working with the government as they progress and develop the GO certification scheme. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
You